evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's really good to have this turnout here. As Derek said, and thank you very much, Derek, for the invitation to be part of this event. My name is Mario. I work mostly as an art historian. I'm very honored here to have on the panel three very accomplished and documentary photographers, all of whom have created very formidable bodies of work in their own right. I think that what I would like to see come out of this conversation, is that on one hand, these three photographers were all part of Afropix, a photographic collective that was established in 1981. But I think it's also quite important to start looking at some of the nuances, the different positions occupied by different photographers. So although we can generalize and identify certain trends and patterns that we can associate with that period, I think what I want us to try and move away from is a very reductive art history that is developing, where we have a very simplistic idea of so-called struggle photography, that then 94 comes and something else happens. So I'm hoping that we can engage with some of those kind of questions, both in terms of the continuities as well as the changes that have happened, but also to see some of the different approaches that photographers have adopted. I think also there's two pivotal concepts here. The one is the question of activism, and what does that mean? Specifically for this generation of documentary photographers, but also more broadly, what does it actually mean for artists in general? But the other point is also the question of art, and how the photography actually relates to art, and how art itself relates to activism. So these are some of the themes that hopefully we will be able to tease out. Now, the format we'll follow is to begin with inputs from the individual photographers here. I'm going to stand on Umar's foot if he exceeds 10 minutes. And we'll just allow that to run. And then from there, I'll either tease out some of those questions and allow them to respond to that. And we'll soon move towards asking for questions so that we can make it the dialogue that it's intended to be, in terms of also involving people here. Because just to acknowledge, this the number of people that are here, Jiva as well is also part of the Afropix story. Paul Sibisi, who is very much from the same generation as Umar, but as a visual artist. A lot of the younger artists that are here, and a lot of people here who've been involved. Tami Jali, also an experienced cultural worker as well. So we've got a lot of interesting voices here tonight, and hopefully we can bring everybody into the conversation. So Umar, I'm going to ask you first to take us back to the beginnings of Afropix, and particularly your role in terms of how you understood your contribution as a photographer and as an activist.
Thank you, Mario. Good evening to everyone. I think we must first and foremost situate this debate, put it in the historical context. We lived in a time when there was incredible repression. Most of us were second-class citizens. Lived in a very, very, very difficult time. In a period where we were at war. Some of us who were part of the liberation movement saw ourselves as soldiers in the struggle. At the same time, some of us in that period were artists. I started off as an artist, worked in the trade unions, worked in the underground, then became a photographer. And throughout those decades, we all grew up with that understanding that we had a responsibility to change society, to break the hold of apartheid, and to create a new society. And that's a very important point I think people need to understand. We were not just out there to overthrow apartheid, but to create a new type of society, which required us to theorize about what it was to be free, and what sort of society. And so what we now are seen as activists, but we were part and parcel of a generation of people, hundreds and thousands of people, who actively fought against apartheid, theorized about it, became active at so many different levels. But in particular, I want to concentrate on the role of the artists and in this case, photographers. We decided to set up in 1981 a collective, and I'm sure many of you know that all of us here, none of us were trained, none of us went to university or art school. We self-taught. And I think among ourselves, there were only a few, our white colleagues, that had gone to university. And so the idea of setting up a collective was also an idea about teaching ourselves and teaching others to find ways of expressing oneself. And so the issue of art and activism, there was very little division. We didn't see it as that. We saw ourselves as artists who had to work as artists, try to make a living as artists, which was incredibly difficult, impossible in some cases. But to find a way of expressing oneself, but bringing people together so that collectively we could find ways of advancing one's own artistic careers. Career is a terrible word because there was no such thing as a career, because one couldn't go and teach in a formal institution. One couldn't exhibit where one wanted to. But notwithstanding the conditions under apartheid, people made life, created, been creative in so many different ways, and whether as individuals or as communities, they created spaces in which there was information, there was education, there was music, there was drama, there was art, there was debate. Sometimes, and most times, those debates were very, very closed and clandestinely. But as people began to mobilize, our audience becomes larger, the debates become more and more bold and open. And that, I think, is a very crucial thing to understand, that as artists, or some of us, we were, quote unquote, professional revolutionaries. We are out there to make a revolution, to change the society. But we did it in a way that, at a time where the link between the intellectual and the community had to be bridged over, and we managed, and one manages in times of incredible social unrest and change to to bring that and bridge that gap between the artist and his community, the artist and the people, similar to what's happening in other countries now, where there is enormous amounts of repression, um, discrimination, violence. People, artists are becoming part and parcel of those movements, whether you are in Burma, or you are in Palestine, or in South America, or in other African countries where there is enormous amount of inequality, poverty, and repression. Artists, people find ways of coming together to build, to institute change. And it was quite an incredible moment for especially the 1980s, where we were able to bridge that gap and mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. What people don't understand is that, or might not appreciate, is that during the period of the 1980s, there were the artists, a small community of artists relative to the population, were at the forefront of change. So you had music, you had photographers, we had, you name it. And so we managed to bring people together out of sheer necessity. Some of us were being called out day and night to go and document something that was happening in Lamontville or Claremont. We were photographers, we were working as photojournalists, and people wanted us to document what was happening. And I began to think about this and felt that no, the way to do it was to go and ensure that we bring young people from those communities and provide them with the skills to document their own communities, to document state repression in those communities. But over time, it was not just state repression. It was to begin to get people to tell their own stories, get photographers to be able to photograph, document their own communities. And so we had a collective, and I was saying earlier to Mario, we set up an agency, and we were not funded at all from any outside funders. We tried to generate our own funding to keep the organization going, to build an organization. And very soon we had projects. We had book publishing projects. We ran annual art and photographic exhibitions. We put together exhibitions that traveled around the world. We did many things, and we did it out of our own resources. We were not totally, and it's very difficult to make people understand that we did it out of the need to mobilize people, to use our photography as a way of speaking out to the world and to our own communities. And that doesn't happen often. And we can come and discuss the situation of young photographers and artists today. But nevertheless, the collective grew and became quite famous around the world. In fact, today, people are asking, there's a big research project being initiated to look at the similarities and differences between us and what we did here and what photographers and progressive photographers in Palestine and Israel who formed a special, they've also formed a collective. And, there's now a dialogue between us and them. And there are other communities and other people around the world who want to know, what did you do and how did you do what you did? Let me stop here because I think my colleagues would have to add to it. They might want to talk about some of the projects that they undertook. Yeah.
Omar, thanks for providing us with that context. And I think already it's interesting how some of the things that you said are still so relevant today, in terms of, for example, the need to try and bridge the intellectual work with actually having an impact at the community level. And also, when you talk about the collective, in Durban, it's very difficult to think about the art scene these days without thinking about Amasoja, what a young group of people have actually done to put themselves on the map. And also, when you talk about, creating Afropix was in part for you guys to also learn from each other, to actually see that that's being reborn in another way in a new context today. But Cedric, can you pick up on yourself coming into your role as a documentary photographer at that time, but also maybe think about how that has evolved for you over time, your conception of yourself as a documentary photographer?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, in as much as, Afropix was a foundational and a very pivotal organization of its time, it was also simply one part of a long process, because the imperative was really one of responding as a creative to a social situation, an adverse social situation, put it that way. So I mean, that was my impulse, was to find a way to respond as a young person becoming conscious of the injustices that I was facing. I think it's a very important thing. I experienced something. I experienced depression for many years, and I spent a lot of time in this city seeing a psychologist to deal with my depression. And I'm ad-libbing here. A Western way of dealing with depression is to say, you've got a chemical imbalance, And I only recently came to understand that in South America there was a whole movement around psychologists, and they call themselves liberation psychologists, who were saying that depression is something that very conscious young people who are fairly smart, when they realize the adverse situation that they find themselves in a capitalist country, they become depressed by it. And so I was this young person looking for a way to engage, and I found it. Fortunately, I was one of the few to find this way. I'd intended to write, and I actually found photography, and fortune favored me, because if you know where I came from, it was almost impossible to find photography. And I stumbled into very receptive people like Umar and others who assisted me, because I didn't have an education. And so I found this alternate education, a much more profound education, I would say, So that set me along a trajectory in which Afropix was, as I said, a foundational part of it. And what I understood was that these images, producing these images, was a way, and I didn't see. I thought I was an activist first, so I was a capital activist wanting to produce images that would be conscious shifting images that would shift people's consciousness about the way they saw the world, the way that they related to the world. And And that's what I set out to attempt. And it was a very difficult mission because I didn't have, I had incredible role models like Umar, but I had to go into the world and create for myself as well. And there was nothing about mimicking what Umar did. And in fact, it was impossible to do that. And so it was a long challenge. And AfriPix was a vehicle in which I exercised that challenge. And along the way, I began to understand that, you wanted to, if you're going to produce images, there was no point in producing images if they weren't actually engaged with. That the whole point of them of doing that was for them to be consumed. And consumed is in the capitalist world is a dirty word because it's got its own connotations. But so that was the mission was then to produce these images, and as one did that, one saw that, in fact, there were some of those images that could be considered art. So I didn't, art was something that came much later, as even beginning to see it as art. But art in itself, one understands, has good art has enormous consciousness shifting ability. It transforms people when people are exposed to it. It can do that. So that was, I would say that was and that is still for me the ongoing, because of course initially we were faced with a social experiment called apartheid that really constrained huge numbers of people and adversely affected our lives as black people. And post-apartheid, one has come to one has understood very acutely that that in fact the reason for apartheid was actually an economic reason that in some ways persists, and so that economic reason is that economic constriction that so many South Africans feel caught in a system that doesn't work in their favor in any way. In fact, is there to exploit them, which is another big theme, that of exploitation. We are an extractive economy in South Africa, in every respect of that word. We are all about extracting. So it's about, that I come from long enough to know that there was a time when we relied very little on shops to live, and now shops predominate. You can't live without shops. So we've been pulled into a system that is all about extracting our labor and presenting the profits of that labor into a very small and big pool. So that's where the shift has taken me to understand the makings of this extractive economy that we exist in, which is, for instance, I'll just say that, for instance, that South Africa was founded by a corporation. It was founded by the world's first corporation, the Dutch East India Company. So it wasn't the Dutch government that came here. The Dutch government supported this because it was a lucrative cash cow, but it was the Dutch East India Company for 200 years that extracted wealth until the British came and said, and then it was the British government who came later and continued the extractive process. So as an image maker, that's what I continue to do, is to try to understand that and to try to reflect that those realities back to us that feed into the decolonial movement, that feed into Fees Must Fall, that feed into a greater consciousness of that things can be different in the world. Things nothing is a given, and so that's where my path as a photographer has taken me.
Okay, Cedric, thank you for highlighting how photography has, in a way, also has grown. Your role as a photographer has grown with your consciousness, and the two have actually fed each other, and how you identify what you've been doing as part of a much longer narrative. So I think that that's one of the things I was saying earlier, that I think it's quite important to, is not to say that nothing changed in 94, but to also recognize that the way that the art history is being written at the moment in particular tends to have this very strong before and after narrative, where one needs to really look at what are the themes that have mutated across time. But one of the other things as well is there's also this other stereotype, not just of Afropics, but of what people will call struggle photography, where there's always this assumption that one was largely documenting atrocities, which was obviously a large part of the impulse behind the documentary photography movement. But there was another side to it as well, which is that as photographers, as human beings, people were responding to everyday situations. And these three photographers that we have here are all very, very interesting for the fact that for many years, and not beginning in 94, but way back, they began photographing family histories, local community histories, and other themes as well. So Raf, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about that in terms of your work, but also how how music has been really important as well. Because when Omar was sketching the broad context, he was saying as cultural workers, there's many dimensions that were involved, and photographers didn't necessarily see themselves as separate to that. Okay. Anywhere you want in there, just dive in.
I'm going to least articulate these guys here, but I grew up in town near the markets, in a fairly mixed community, even though we didn't mix at the time. Omar's father and my father were friends. Omar's father was a great artist as well. But one thing I learned from my dad was empathy for other people. And that's come through as well in a lot of ways for me. We didn't start out to be artists. We didn't start out to be activists, or maybe Omar. But circumstances brought us together and that kind of thing. I grew up, like I say, in that area there, which is, they used to refer to it as a grey area. And we eventually had to move out because of the Group Areas Act, and that was something that always impacted on me. Why do I have to leave my community, my friends? But there was thousands of people in other places that similar parallels. So I got into photography through Umar. I was unemployed at the time, a young man, recently married with a baby, a wife and a baby. I'm still unemployed now, but that's another story. But the issues that we dealt with at the time, are relevant today, and that's the young Amasojo movements. I don't know how they deal with those things and interpret them, but it was education, housing, whatever, there were things. And as photographers, I was more of a backroom boy. I worked in the darkroom for a long time, and I assisted in the admin of Afropics for a while with Di Stewart, who was our admin person. But I also started photographing the area I came from, that area down the road there. The people from there, we call it the district, also there's nothing to do with District 6, but there are similarities. So I got into it like that there, and we had to do news photography as well, partly to survive and partly because a lot of the stories that were happening out in the townships and other places weren't being told in the mainstream media. And we didn't have a big enough alternative media to highlight those situations. So one of the things we did was work with a journalist collective called Concord, which was Fred Kumalo, Christina Scott, Rafora Rangongo, Sipo Kumalo, and a couple of others. And we'd meet once a week because people had their ears to the ground in the townships. And eventually people got to know how to contact us. But those guys knew what was going down there. And those stories that they were talking about were not covered by the Daily News and the Mercury and the Witness, occasionally the Witness or the Sunday Tribune. So that's how we started doing news work as well. But you'd find yourself in a situation where you go to a meeting or a rally or some event in the township, and you never got there when the shit was happening. You came there when usually after things had happened, people had been tear gassed or shamrocked or shot at and stuff like that. There was no instant media like today with your social media or your thing. If you said there are people, that was like the height of technology at the time. But yeah, we got there usually after things had happened. So there'd be bodies and kids and people bashed and whatever. And you had to deal with this stuff, or you'd go to funerals, and there was a cycle of violence that just went week after week after week. A funeral this week, people at that funeral, you knew next week you'd be going to their funeral. There was all that kind of stuff happening. So for me, the refuge was, I found out about the rainbow and music. I always loved music. I wanted to be a sound engineer. I couldn't do that in the 70s and the 80s. But we'd go to these meetings or rallies and stuff like that and go to the rainbow afterwards. And then that was my refuge in terms of that. And that's what I do mostly these days is music, because I love music and musicians. But like I say, we didn't start out to be artists. We became activists through our photography and things like that. But it wasn't for me, it wasn't a conscious decision. I was just, like I say, unemployed at the time. I don't know if that helps.
You know, we talk about activism, and the image that comes across is of photographers on the front line documenting the struggle, and you get the word struggle photographers. But the struggle was more than just change of government. The struggle was also about beginning to represent yourself, to question the dominant way in which in a racist society, how people were represented in the media, in the arts, in the university, in every aspect of life. So what is important is that we began to interrogate that. We began to debate that aspect. So you talk about, today you call it decolonizing. But that aspect of our work, or that part of what was the struggle, was also to theorize about what it is to be black, how black people have been represented in the media, in the arts, in every aspect of life, and to turn that around. So in our work as artists and as photographers, we began to become very sensitive to how people lived, how people were represented. And so when you talk about activism, sometimes it obscures those nuances, and one needs to be able to unpack that. Today, there's a huge debate. It's around race, it's around gender, but we dealt with gender issues. You know, we were, I think, in many ways, years ahead of others in the arts, in the sense that we photograph people, women in particular, in new ways, in a way that gave them dignity, in a way that recognized them as key players and not somebody secondary to how they were represented or how they were being socialized. And so that began to emerge, and in some ways we changed the way people were looked at. I don't think we totally succeeded, because patriarchy, racism still exists, but we began to be very sensitive to those issues. Many academics today call us the fist and flag generation, or the activists of struggle photography, without understanding what we were doing and what we have began to set out to do. So it was a conscious thing. And so when you look at some of the work now, you see that. And so same issues that we were faced then are being faced now. In fact, this generation has a much, much more difficult challenge because you have the level of violence internal to our own communities, like it's, unprecedented. The breakdown of communities and solidarity and the enormous amount of anger that also comes in its wake, so that you stop looking at people as people. You're looking at them as groups again, as somebody who, as a male who's now a danger to women. He's now the main perpetrator of violence against women or children. So, there is a sea change since 1994. But as activists, the thing that one all the time have to deal with is how to draw attention to things and how to make sure that people begin to act collectively to change those conditions. And I think that issue of representation, of bearing witness, all of these things are interlinked. The other thing that is very interesting, because I deal with a lot of young people, a lot of young artists, and one of the things that I find that many of the younger generation, unlike us, notwithstanding that we didn't go to university, we had our study groups. We read extensively. Today, I find that many of the young artists don't read enough. Most of our ideas come from reading and discussing issues, unpacking issues. Derek talked about the national question. There's a big word, national question. And Derek and I can begin to debate this issue, this notion of the national question. And so those sort of issues we debated. Those debates didn't exist in many of the universities of our time. But a lot of our education came from the discussion groups that we set up, that reading that we did. You'll be surprised, most of our work has a lot of, crossover to music, to literature. References continuously emerge in our work that feed into each other. And I think that part of being an activist then and now is to understand the nature of your society. In other words, to study what is happening, to read as much. A lot of my ideas as a photographer come from just the newspaper, following some of the stories from there, and that then becomes a project. Activism means being open to new ideas, learning on a continuous basis, is very central to this notion of social change and activism.
Yeah, I think that's, Omar, thank you for that definition of activism, because I think it's, what for me is very interesting is, on one hand, where you have people where there's no debate, they were activists. They are still activists, sorry about the word, but when we think back to how people conducted themselves in the 70s, the 80s, etc. So, and then people continuing. So there's no, it's not up for debate. It's recognized that documentary photographers were activists. But what I found quite interesting is that the term activist is today used in the art world about work that often doesn't engage with society at all. It's very often used in a lot of performative work, where work is staged in public, where just the idea of it being in public qualifies people as being called as activists. Now, I'm not trying to necessarily get into who's an activist and who's not an activist, but I think there's many different forms of activism. And I think what is I'm losing my thread here. Sure, haven't handled that one very well. Yeah, okay, I want to switch to the art world, actually. It's really where I'm trying to go, because I think that's the other anchor in this conversation. And I think what is interesting, and this is actually what I forgot that I wanted to say, is that within that same art world, there's a very ambivalent response to the documentary photography tradition. On one hand, there's a recognition of the role people played. On the other hand, there's a belittling. When Omar uses words like flag and fist, there's actually almost a derogatory edge that's actually implied in that they weren't really major photographers. They were just sensationalists photographing misery. There's a whole bodies of critique. People have written whole theses on those kind of positions. There's a whole sort of negative critique about representation of poverty. And of course, there are different ways that one can engage in terms of representation and poverty. But it's almost become kind of taboo for many photographers today to even go there. So it's almost that we've got a counter aesthetic that's emerged, that we have to show a more positive image, we have to show a more affluent image, which again is not in itself necessarily a bad thing. But I think that I don't know what's happening to me here today. I think it's these lights. I'm not used to sitting here with all these lights on me like this.
Maybe I could come in.
Come in there, please, Cedric.
Collect your thoughts.
Please come in. Save me.
And maybe we could also invite the audience at this point to start.
But I think what I'm wanting to get to is how you yourselves relate to how art has changed in this time as well. Because in particular, Cedric, you've been occupying quite an interesting position. There have been a lot of curators who've been very interested in your work. At the same time, you and Omar have this tradition of producing books. Omar meets Okwi Enwezor, and what does he do? He fights with him. Most people in the art world will bow to Okwi to please include him in the next show.
That's because he's an activist with a capital A first.
So I'm interested in this question of, it's also the art world that has changed in this time. And the art world has this ambivalent response to you as documentary photographers. And you have one foot in and one foot out. So how do you actually manage that?
I think that there's been an unfortunate thing that's happened in the art world, where, in some parts of the world, that is, where it's as though some movements can only emerge by trampling and by destroying the previous one. So it's this zero-sum take that is a part of the Western world. It's one business that one business will consume another business and grow from the consumption of another business, and this, so that you have the same thing happening with art, within the art world, of movements consuming a previous generation of movements and growing out of that into something else. And it's an unfortunate thing, because it's part of our exploitative way in which we engage with the world, with nature, and with each other as well. But what I think has happened is that those same negative critiques that were delivered against us as being fists and flag photographers were based on ignorance, or perhaps malice, to use that as a quick way of destroying this movement so you could emerge. Because they weren't based on fact. All our bodies of works, 90% of it was not fists and flags. It was really dealing with serious documentation, going and examining different aspects of society that had absolutely nothing to do with marches or protest or even that naked repression. But the curious thing happened to us, which I was very aware of always, that we produced an archive of images. That was the whole role of Afripix. produce an archive of images, and we did respond to the flags and fists. We found it quite exciting as well. That 10% of us was like, yay, people are revolting. They are resisting, and we photographed that. And the young editors of all those publications that came through, that emerging in the early 80s, there was a huge alternate press that emerged. Those were all fairly illiterate, visually illiterate people who were even newspapers, the publications that we consumed, didn't have, even few magazines had actual trained visual people as picture editors. Photography, you must remember, in the 70s and 80s and further back wasn't considered as it was illustration in publications. I mean, I've sat and spoken to editors and said, you have to be crazy to think that an image is, an image has so much information in it. In fact, the studies were actually showing that when people looked at a newspaper, they were and made a decision as to whether to buy it, they looked at the headline, and the next thing they did was they looked at the image, and that determined whether they were going to read that newspaper or read that article. So the image is really a powerful, and it's a powerful object. It's a powerful device of communication. So to think that the kind of people actually hadn't researched the work we did, and it's as we began to continue producing exhibitions and producing and the incredibly difficult thing of producing a book in this country, a photographic book in particular. I met Umar in 1982. Umar had produced a book. It was miraculous for a black person to have produced a photographic book in this country, because editors, book publishers, scoff at you. I spent almost 15 years trying to get a publisher to publish my first book. And the first publisher that I got to do it was a German publisher, not a South African publisher. So where in Germany, there is no question about and of course, maybe it's a bigger economy, you understand all of that. But there's also a consciousness. It's no accident that the Gutenberg press emerged in Germany. There's a serious consciousness about the power of publication and the necessity of publication in people's lives. And we haven't quite caught up to that, because we are still caught in a thing of, we publish actually for profit. We really, we are caught in that thing. And the whole mantra that we've heard even post-1994 is profit. We all have to profit somehow. And if you can't profit, you're irrelevant. You mean nothing. And so no resources are sent in your direction, and you are left to wither and die on the vine. Because all that matters in an extractive economy really is profit. And of course, there are areas where there are oases that exist that serve to nourish the arts, if you want, and other culture, but they are far and few. We're still in a nascent, emerging place as people trying to create an environment in which the arts can really flourish. I mean, I remember Albie Sachs coming back in the early 90s and saying it's the time for the flowering of the arts beyond beyond struggle. Well, I'd like to hear what he has to say about that flourishing now, whether he thinks that it's actually, because, it disarmed us in many ways, that those statements like that really disarmed. We thought, this struggle really over? And we were still hopeful that the state was going to deliver on all those things that we thought it was going to do, that we'd fought for, we thought that the Freedom Charter meant something, and suddenly we found that it was an ethereal object that just disappeared. And we were all left to regroup and refine ourselves much faster than we thought we'd have to do. We always thought this was going to be a long, difficult journey of re-emergence. You can't have 400 years of oppression and then just emerge out of it within an instant like that. But we haven't that challenge that we thought was going to happen has been far more severe, because we've had a regression actually, where we've been cut loose and thrown to the vagaries of the marketplace.
Thank you, Cedric. I think, are you wanting to come in, Russ?
Well, I think the times are different now. Obviously, you can all start a selfie and look at it instantly and post it instantly. Those days was difficult photography. And it was more of a rich person's hobby for a lot of the time. And we had very few photographic heroes. Umar is a person that published, Peter Magubani and David Goldblatt are the only people I could think of as local photographers. If we wanted to look at other people's work, we had to go to the library and read British news and American newspapers, or go sit in the American embassy and look at the farm administration. So we didn't have photographic, mentors as such. We had to make do with our own sort of thing, yeah. I'm losing my thread too.
So, we can be forgiven. You see our...
But yeah, it was a different time then, and it's a lot of the issues that Cedric and Umar speak about are still relevant today to the young artists today, and how they deal with it is completely different to the way we sort of have to deal with it, yeah.
Okay, I think at this stage I'm going to ask if anybody wants to either direct questions to members of the panel or to make particular comments. I'm going to ask that you just introduce yourself, because this is being recorded.
Hello everybody, I'm Coral Vinson. I'm the current chair of Amnesty International, so I'm a long-time activist. And just to share some early memories of art in Durban that maybe Omar's not going to tell us about, but he won the first prize when the African Arts Centre had an art exhibition here in the Durban Art Gallery, and I remember that art. But subsequently in 1988, in order to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with Lorna Ferguson and myself, we were both Black Sash members. We convened a National Human Rights Art Exhibition here at the CAP. I think that was, what was it called? Yes. And so one of the first, we had a National Human Rights Art Exhibition, so artists from all over the country sent and worked, and we ran it for 10 days, and the work could be sold as well, and the photographic exhibition as well. And the winning photograph was by Billy Paddock. He was a photograph. He worked for the Daily News, I think, one of the papers here, and it was of a little woman standing in the township with a huge army vehicle, one of those, what do they call? Caspers coming, and there she stood, stopping them. It was such a brave, courageous act for this ordinary township lady. And so subsequently in 1997 I convened, because I got interested in the link between art and human rights, so I convened Images of Human Rights. We started Artists for Human Rights, a little group, and that's how we ran that first exhibition. And then subsequently we took South Africa's Bill of Rights, and we gave out the clauses to all the art galleries all over the country, and they chose their best print artists to make images of those particular clauses. And so that portfolio was a limited edition called Images of Human Rights, and it was opened in the art gallery in 1997 by Albie Sachs. And here's Trish, who was working at the art gallery at that time. Yes, and she did the catalogue for us. So, thanks.
If I can just say that before somebody comes up, that just speaks to the importance of civil society also coming. We don't have to all sit around waiting for government. We have a crisis in the country now, and one that, in the way that we had a crisis in the 1960s or in the 1970s with 76 or in the 80s with the state of emergency. We have a crisis now that needs to be responded to by civil society.
Well, the Active Citizens Movement is formed in Durban. So that's a group of civil society, and some of my colleagues are here.
I think before I went to Rockstreet, most of the images that came from Rockstreet were mainly religious. But I went to Rockstreet I went there in 1981, and already by 1981, the images were becoming political and mainly because of 1976. I think. Because after 1976, especially with the people who came from Soweto, people who actually experienced the uprising. I know it happened all over the country, but it was mainly centered in Soweto. So it was obvious that they would start producing images that were about the struggle, So I remember that one of the pieces that I produced in Rockstreet in my first year, it was called The People's Leaders, because already there people were like addressing the political situation in the country. So one was literally, compelled to actually respond to the situation, because as all the panelists here have said that there was violence all over. You couldn't for instance, the work that I mentioned, the People's Leaders. It put me in all sorts of trouble, because I had to be asked, as to who are the leaders that I'm talking about, and there was this. Now they're called the SPs and everything, So there were many challenges. So it was pretty tough to operate. In those days, and Cedric mentioned that. It looks like we have the same challenges now. Situation hasn't really changed, and it looks like we have to go back to those images. We have to conscientize people, to re-conscientize people again. Can be, as the late Peter Mackenzie said, it was just a joke, and he said we can't be painting cats and dogs now. When there's so much. When there's so much anger in the country, and I think you see this in the townships. People feel that they're not getting the rewards of the struggle. We know that the struggle. It didn't mean that. When we have conquered, we would become rich. It wasn't like there was no thought of material, things. It was just a way. A way to express yourself, and a way to.
A better life for all.
Better life for all, and I was asked who are these leaders, and I said, I feel I'm one of them, because I've got the skills to draw. I can do lino, when so many people don't have the skills, So skills have always been very, very important, and the Rockcliffe diploma was not even recognized by the government. So what was important was that you go there, get your skills, and there was actually a probation period at Rockcliffe to see if you are trainable or not. So it was important that people get the skills in order that they're able to express themselves. So I think that's basically what we as artists, getting involved in the human rights portfolio and the murals, the Bill of Human Rights, which was for me that whole process of painting the mural was very, very important. It was a very important learning curve because we all had to understand what we were doing. So, a human rights lawyer, human rights lawyer came to explain what the Bill of Human Rights means. So we got a chance to learn, and we also got a chance to interpret the clauses and the meaning of it for the general public. So that's great.
We're going to have a quick ad break. Yes. Cedric? No, I just thought, Tammy being up here speaking about, his trajectory and his role and his history with Rockcliffe, I would take the opportunity to tell you that I made a documentary on Rockcliffe. And in that documentary, the art historian Philippa Hobbs, who wrote, this is an extraordinary art school that existed, that produced people like Tammy and many others that have transformed the landscape, has had one book written about it, Empowering Prince, and inspired me to make a documentary film on it because there had been nothing like that. And in it, in the film, Philippa Hobbs says that, in fact, even though Rockcliffe's diploma wasn't recognized by the state, and even though Rockcliffe was this impoverished, relatively impoverished institution, it in fact had the most diverse and diverse curriculum and an impactful curriculum in the country. So, it says that, it tells us that with very little resources, sometimes we can actually be incredibly impactful, and we shouldn't just have this focus that we have right now on, being well endowed in terms of resources, in terms of needing that to be able to, because we started out with nothing. In all of us, Umar, all of us, we started with absolutely nothing, and not even a hope of making a material gain out of what we were doing. We did it for other, and I think that's a message, that a counter message, that an alternate message to the one that is propagated by the state and by the machinery that looks to appropriate. There's this thing of appropriating culture, youth culture, aspects of trends, fashion, this extractive industry. That's what it lives for. It lives for, yet it must have a new manifestation of something new that it can appropriate and convert into rands and cents or dollars, and that's counter to the true building of culture. And art is just one aspect of building culture, and that's really what we have been about, is about culture rather than, so art, that's why art came later. It's about how do you change this culture, this negative culture that is in the world. And art is one way of doing it, and being an activist is another, and there are other ways as well of doing it.
Yeah, I think just to pick up also on the reference to Rockcliffe, because it actually also brings into the conversation the question of the history of community art centers in this country, which in many ways, in many instances, were the places where a lot of the debates about arts and social activism took place. I'm using community centers in quite a broad way, not necessarily always physical centers, sometimes also collectives of people. We've heard that AfroPix itself, wasn't funded. But we also had a history of a number of projects, which Rooksrift was also part of, where there was external funding. And I think that's also one of the changes that actually happened, was that, with the prospect of political change and that the whole system was going to change, that whole tradition really fell away, with international funding in particular not being directed. The government itself embarked on a program of building community arts centers that flopped completely. And I'm bringing this to today, to Durban, to Amasoja, again, because here, in a sense, is I'm not calling it a new AfroPix, but it's a new collective of people who have taken the initiative themselves to say, okay, well, we're going to organize ourselves. We're going to learn from each other. And also, just to say, Omar, I think in general your comment about people not reading is correct, and maybe that's got to do with social media, which I think has had a major negative impact on people's ability to actually read in general. But really, if I can do an advert for Amasoja, I mean, Amasoja put out a call for people to donate books, and trying to build a resource center. So I do want to ask whether anybody from Amasoja wants to come into the conversation in terms of how you understand your contribution in terms of arts and activism today.
I'm very glad to get this opportunity to be amongst the elders and to share these dialogues, because as they say, I always feel like there's always something that we have to follow as artists. And the struggle still continues, as they say, because on what they were commenting on during the apartheid, and us, we are facing the results of those things as the young society, and we are facing these challenges because most of the time, especially on Amasoja, we come from townships, and most of the townships, they were developed on the apartheid time, but now we are faced with challenges of living in those societies and trying to make life. And when we were meeting as the collective, our mission was to make arts that would demand change on the society, or arts that would demand action, since we were feeling there's so many things that we have been commenting on as artists and as elders, but there's no change that we see too much on the society. But especially I like to look at art itself as something that can be not seen as a hobby, but as something that can allow people to think beyond what the situation, and to be able to bring issues, in a matter of criticizing them, challenging them, celebrating some of them, and to see how we can have dialogues. Because I feel the modern space doesn't allow dialogue like this, where people can be able to engage. We always stay on our phones and on our computers. So I think dialogue like this are very important for us to engage and to share our thoughts, to share our experience, and see how we can make change with creativity. Yes.
The first one is the issue of funding, and Umar spoke about when we were in AfroPix and how AfroPix largely was self-funded. But it seems that in the post-94 dispensation, in the democratic dispensation, there's enough to steal from arts and culture, but never enough to feed artists and support artists. And I think the onus lies upon us as artists to start challenging government and the state. That's the one issue. The other issue is this, the issue of collectives. We had AfroPix, we had FOSACO, which nobody talks about, the Federation of South African Cultural Organizations. Umar will talk more about it. We had Vakalisa in the Western Cape. You remember, you were part of that, Mario. With James Matthews. Yeah. And largely, and this question, Omar, perhaps you could address it to Cedric and Rafs. There was a large socialist element, a language that spoke to a social and socialist consciousness, which has somehow dissipated and it's become largely individualistic. I think somebody in the panel mentioned. And I'm not saying that's the answer, but the more we get sucked into this capitalist system that Cedric's been talking about, the more we seem to have lost this where we were, and I was glad to hear the word cultural worker again. I've not heard it in the last 10, 15 years. As cultural workers, were engaged. So I think it's time we need to rethink and re-examine our own roles, as opposed to waiting for somebody else to do it.
This discussion surround us as artists. We forget that one of the major goals of New South Africa was to ensure that every child had the ability to have a full education, to be creative, and to use their creativity to build a whole new country. And we forget that. We forget that we actually should collectively be questioning the government about its art education programs. And that's quite fundamental. And yeah, the role of the artists is, well, some of the artists should be in the forefronts of making sure that art education, art centers are supported by the state, so that what we produce are full-rounded individuals who are creative individuals, and it's one of the, I think, quite fundamental things that we forget, that we need to put an enormous amount of energy to reform the education system.
For sure.
Yeah, I wanted to just say something in defense of reading, and in defense of the youth, and in defense of social media, because I think I think that the world is somewhat different today, and about 10 years ago, I finally, as somebody who's not an academic, got access to the central library database of the South African universities, and I went there armed with my reading list. I have a reading list that's now it's over 1,000 books, and I presented my reading list, and the library didn't have 2% of the books I wanted to read. So I think there's, what social media has done for me is that and what the internet has done is that it's accessed that information that has been kept out of the libraries and kept out of the institutions of higher learning. And youth, young people, some of them, I think quite a few of them, access that information. And they read differently because they have entered a world where they're not just confronted with half a dozen newspapers, regional newspapers. They are confronted with a huge pool of information that comes from around the world, globally. And so what they have to do is they have to surf and skim this huge, and every now and again they can dive down into a well and drink from that well. But because the amount of information is so vast, that's what they're doing. And so I think that I would be loath to dismiss young people. I think that this is a powerful, powerful tool that young people have access to, and it is transforming them. And we see it in the way that those young people respond to fees must fall or roads must fall and the whole decolonial movement. We see this new perspective that people have, and I think we must honor that, and we must nurture it as well, and we must, like I do with my young daughter, we have to, whether you see, the basis is to encourage these young people to go out, because they are the future generation that needs to, they are the Masoshas of the world who need to take the transformation of society forward?
I'll be very brief. I won't be long. Because I won't be long. Why? You know, when I look at the text, it just represents. I've just seen Raj Gopal now. I couldn't notice him. But I've seen him physically. I couldn't say this is Raj Gopal, whom I've worked with over the 80s. So being born in the 40s and then experiencing the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and then 90s when Mandela was released. And then now we are in the 200s. So it's 2000. So it's a collage. I look at myself as a collage because I was born in 1948. When I was born, the circumstances around me in the 60s, I've read something which has not been read by someone who has been born free. Those who are born after 1990, the born frees are here. But now, the situation in which we have got to transgress it cannot be done just now, today. But this is the beginning. I wish that Mario, Omar, Cedric, and Ralph, after they have left, we need a forum. Even myself, I need that forum. The forum, which has got to happen at least once per month or twice. The forum for all of us, young, those who have been born after, who are born free, and those who have been born during Verwoeden times. We need a forum where we can discuss. You know, when Professor Arisitas, when I was with him at the Bed Center during the 90s, he said, Paul, you know, you as artists, we need these disciplines: drama, music, arts, dancers. In the discipline of arts, there must be a forum. Let me say at the Durban Art Gallery, there's a forum where we all have got to air our thoughts. We air our thoughts. Let us say the Masosha, they come and talk about themselves and about their grievances and how are they continuing with their present work consistently. And the young people have got to come with their ideas. That is, after I have left, if there could be a forum or a desk, whatever, we call it, and then we come together, and then we discuss about ourselves. I'm from Umlazi. I was born at Mkumba and grew up at Chesterville, and then now I'm at Umlazi. I'm not living in a suburb, in what was called formerly white suburbs. There are so many of those who have been born after 1990. They are living at Westville, they are living at Umhlanga. They are not like me, but we're experiencing the same problems. Because now, let me just say, recently, what has touched all of us is fear. I'm so scared, even myself. If a parent is just taking a nap at a C model school in our country, and when he is awoken by he's waiting for in order to be safe so that he can transport him home safely, the young man who is at school. When he's waking him up, Can you imagine living in a fearful South Africa? Fear more than the era in which I lived in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And then when he wakes up, he thinks of hijacking. He says, oh, I'm being hijacked. And then he draws out a gun. And then he fires and kills his own son because of fear. Can we live? How can we survive in such a fearful country where I can kill my own? If I wake up at night and I hear a sound, if I've got a gun, I can just draw a gun and go to the bedroom and kill my own child. This is the situation in which we are living. Good people, we must not shame. We must not be apologetic about our country. We are living in I think, most violent situation in which we are living. Myself, if I can portray my own former president doing something which, being sensitive, because I'm a sensitive artist, let me say there's something which I do not agree, and then I portray it in my work. Tomorrow, I'll be hunted down by the mafia, saying that this one must be eliminated because he has spoken ill of his president. And you people are not there. And then I'll be hunted down. Then I'll be in hiding. We remember, Oma, they remember when one was in hiding during the apartheid era, when we were being sorted by the SPs. Because the SPs, one of my friends, let me not say friends, let me say peer group. During the time when we grew up, we used to speak about where the detainees were held here at where the road has been named. That road has been named after the.
My elder. May I remind you that you are going to be brief?
But now, I'm brief now. I'm ending it. We must be very, not being we must say things as they are. When one of my peer groups, he told me, Paul, if ever they can detain you, when you get into that detention room with the torturers, it's written on the wall with blood, human blood. Don't say angazi. Do not say you do not know. Written in blood of a human, even your own blood is going to be used. Telling me that, I'm going to die. He was telling me that if ever you enter into this resistance, you must face those consequences. But now, we're facing different consequences now, where you can be hijacked on the freeway. When you are driving on the freeway, you are hijacked, cash heist. Let me stop. Yeah, I totally.
Given that I'm not from South Africa, me and all of my friends here were all students from the U.S. We are all college students studying at different universities around the U.S., but we came together to study here in South Africa for 6 weeks, a program called Education and Social Change, and our program told us about this happening tonight, and so we came and joined. So I've learned a lot from this. My perspective on the issue is much more comparative in terms of thinking about some of the similarities and differences between what the struggles and the movements of resistance have been at home in the U.S. Comparatively to here, but I have a lot of very textbook-bound factual information about the history of the country, but not very much experiential history. We've only been here for about 3 weeks now. But I'm learning so much, and thank you for letting us be among you.
I was just going to say that, like, from my experience, the way that we perceive art is in narratives, the visuals through social medias, predominantly where we are consuming these images, and these images buy into a narrative, and people either, like, sorry, struggling to bring my point together, but there's so many narratives, and the images are used to build these narratives, whether they be truthful or not truthful. You look at social media as like almost a battleground where these images are used as tools to try and convince people of your point of view. People misconstrue what has happened. You see pictures being used from 2012 as if it had happened yesterday. It's really difficult to see. It's really difficult to crystallize what is happening and what did happen when people are misusing visuals or using visuals to tell a very, very particular narrow narrative. There's very little kind of just telling things how they happen. It's narratives and counter-narratives. I think you were focusing on narratives and counter-narratives. And I don't know, that's my perception of art in the 21st century. It's you fully support one ideology or another, and there's very little capturing of the nuances and what is actually happening. Yeah, just a perspective. Derek, you want to
follow up on this because it has a lot to do with that. And in defense of Omar and in defense of Cedric, although I think the reading is very important because it allows one a certain withdrawal to yourself and the book, okay, or your laptop if you're doing it. Whereas what you've just pointed to is this constant barrage of image and fact or non-fact, whatever it is, and so there's a whole lot going on, and I think both are important. I think both are important, but there's something about retreating into the quietness of a space or into yourself to read a text, to read an article, whatever it is that you're reading, or a newspaper. There's something about taking, because that slows you down. The act of reading slows you down, and you start reading the words and your mind. Whereas on I call the Twitter politicians, this one line, one thing that, you quote one sentence from Fanon and suddenly you're a Fanon scholar. You've never read the book, but you've read somewhere this quote, and so you quote it, and then you take it totally out of its context of how Fanon wrote it. You must remember, Fanon was French taught, and his circumstance was North Africa, and so we're using Fanon, and good we should, but what are we doing here? Where's our intellectual engagement for our context? North Africa is a good example. Sankara is another one. You look at Mozambique. Yes, there were many people that can teach us something about revolution, but we don't need them to teach us about our revolution that we want to have. We've got to make it happen.
Being inundated with information and images, and how does one begin to slow down and reflect on what has been said? Very interesting. In the 1900s, a chap by the name of Gandhi posed the same question. And he said, there's so much of information those days a telegraph. And one needs to make sense of the world. So he comes up with a theory of slow reading. And he institutes it in his newspaper that he sets up called the Indian Opinion. But the same problem. Problem is the same. How does one begin to how does one reflect, how does one educate oneself and others about being discerning, to re-look and to read slowly and to continuously interrogate ideas and information. And we, I think, all artists continuously grapple with that same issue. But it's today a little bit more complex in the sense that we do not educate the young children at school about being discerning readers. I might be putting it badly, putting it wrongly, and it happens largely because the one way of dealing with that, and the way we dealt with it, was to have small reading groups. And if you're in a classroom, smaller groups where people engage and learn to interpret in images, words, and it's an art. It's an art. And those discussion groups are very useful. Like now, you're throwing an idea about being inundated with massive amount of information. How does one begin to interrogate all of that, concentrate on a few ideas, and then begin to develop your own point of view? That's why I think if we were able to train enough of our young people in the arts to be able to have an education system which allows us to do that, and we build that into an education system. And so, yeah, it's been an eternal problem, eternal challenge, let me put it that way. And there's no easy answer to it.
So there's this title, of course, of struggle photographers and so on. And in a way, and what you're talking about, Mario, is looking at works that span pre and post, during apartheid and post apartheid. And I'm wondering, during the transition years, how did the photographers respond, feel during that time? With the promise of a new era, and how were you able to position or relocate yourself in a rapidly changing environment? And I mean, Omar has gone to do the important work that he does with the archive that he's working on, digital space. Cedric is also playing, publishing repeatedly, and in that way, so you sort of move away from like the camera as the tool and as the weapon, and sort of play a different role in post-apartheid South Africa. Was that a consequence? Did you find yourself as not a victim of circumstance, but were you responding to a condition or a circumstance that was changing quite rapidly, and you felt you had to play a different role than you did during apartheid?
I think many of us who come from that particular period, who didn't go into government, who didn't go into that particular political arena, a new political arena, had continued to work in a way that allowed us to interrogate what was happening around us, reflecting on it and acting on it. So in many ways, we haven't changed at all. We're asking the same questions. And And in some cases, we are asking it openly. I'm one of those, like many other veterans, who stood up and said, what is happening in the ANC and in government is wrong. And many people were very angry with us. But we stood up and continued to say what we had to say. We haven't changed. We shouldn't be changing, because essentially we fought for a particular set of ideas about freeing the human personality, freeing ourselves, and freeing ourselves from poverty and inequality and ignorance. The word ignorance, very crucial. We don't use it that often, but we have to free ourselves from ignorance. And we can only do that by engaging. And the institutions like the Mzala institution and others that have sprung up in the last couple of years are all involved with that notion of how to take this country back, to take or to reinstate the values and create new institutions. So yeah, it is a incredible challenge. The challenge is made much more difficult now because of the massive inequalities. You can't have a country where nearly 60% of the population is less under 30, and nearly half of that is unemployed or undereducated, in a very fast transforming society. We have to collectively find ways of doing it. And we've now learned in the last 10 years that we can't depend on the state to do that. The state has failed or the political parties have failed to deliver, and that we are now demanding a new way of building a new democracy, a participatory democracy. So we want local involvement. So it hasn't changed from the period that we worked in. And so we need to reinstate. So a discussion like this is very important, because it shows, it makes us think about the past in new ways. But images are very powerful, because they evoke new ways of looking at the past and the present. And so, we keep on plugging our career, professions as image makers, but as also visual artists.
I think, Russell, the question you ask it's an important. It's asked fairly often, and it is an important question because it does. Things change. And that adage that sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. And certainly things changed I can speak for myself. That period of the 80s and the early 90s. I had a certain. I was part of something that created a certain stability within that turmoil that was taking place. So, in other words, we had a means of acquiring the resources we needed to replicate and to produce the work that we produced. And then you will know, and I think Umaro alluded to it earlier, that the scenario shifted radically after 1994. And one of the big things that took place was that the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations that we primarily relied on, that alternate media and the non-governmental organizations, disappeared. The funding was cut from them deliberately and transferred to government. And then I very quickly realized that it was impossible for me to work for government, because government has this big communications organism called GCIS. I forget, government communications.
Yeah.
And government communications, if they were going to give you an assignment, insisted on taking all copyright of the work that you produced. And for us, the autonomy and the independence of owning our own images and being able to use those images in ways that was paramount. And it was such an affront. That was my first rude awakening, was when this government that I thought was so progressive suddenly was using the most regressive copyright intellectual property act to discriminate against us, and citing that they wanted full exploitative rights over those images. It was their right constitutionally, and it was. And so suddenly I was between a rock and a hard place in terms of not having this resource that I thought would allow me to continue doing the other work that I wanted to do. And so for a short while, I actually had to resort to corporate work, to keep. I had a young teenager daughter that was in a private school that needed a university education, and that was a priority at that point in time. But it also gave me the time to think and to look at this shifting scenario, and it in itself was also shifting rapidly. So it was a very hard thing to understand. And as Umar said, it's only in the last 10 years that we fully understood that we are in a terrible situation now, that in fact we've been led deeper and deeper into this morass, And so we all react differently to this. My personal road has been to say, I need to step way back and look at deep history. When I opened my first exhibition of that historical thing, I had the very eminent professor of photography and art, Rory Bester, speak at the opening, and he said, "Oh, this is called aftermath photography." It was the first time I'd heard of that word, aftermath photography, that we were living in the aftermath. But he was saying that this aftermath photography is quite different to the one that normally happens, because the one that normally happens is the aftermath of a battle that is in living memory, 50 years ago, 20 years ago. And the work I was looking at, namely the Xhosa 100-year war of resistance that nobody knows about in this country, happened, more than, it happened 200 years ago, and it was 100 years. And that made me realize that I need to go even further back and look at that first act of dispossession that took place against the Khoi and the San, that we now call color, that we've even forgotten. For 100 years, there was no such a thing as Khoi. So we have such a convoluted history here that has been hidden from us by the same canons that come from the universities, largely kept in those reservoirs for a few specialists, and obfuscated in the way that it receives, that we receive it. And so my role has been to go back and look at that, and to look at the fact that we had 200 years of brutal slavery in this country, and to see the similarities that took place in all other colonial projects, whether they were North America or South America or Australia, I showed this work in the US, and I had so many people come and say, that's our story. That's our story. Because it's a colonial, imperial story. And it continues to this day. Because the extraction that we experience is that story. It continues. They're just new actors and a different way of playing the game.
Okay, I think it's probably time to wrap up. I just want to rest. Do you want to make any last comments before we close?
Well, much to say, but it's hard to photograph hope, Russell. Just like it's hard to photograph humor. But the period of transition that you speak about, we have to think about photographing in a different way. The other thing is, like, don't know if people read Roald Dahl, talk about reading. And he said something, he was a photographer for a while during World War II or something. He said, photography is the art of the talentless. And there's times when I agree with him, but there's other times when I beg to differ. Really. Because an image moves me still. And I try to look into it and see other things.
My name is Bushewanda Mbambo. I'm a visual artist. And I felt I should say something as well as a person who's working in modern times as a visual artist operating here in Durban, who's also producing some sort of more conceptual art, which is dealing more with social issues or whether economical issues. I'm very inspired by such movement as yourself, you have mentioned. Living in the modern times, I think there's a lot that has changed, but at the same time, as the youth of today, we are still dealing with certain pieces of the apartheid era, whether individually or collectively. As for myself, I've just realized that there's quite a lot actually that I'm experiencing, which is like it's sort of a taste of oppression, like coming from my own background as a person who's coming from the rural area, where most of my parents worked as domestic workers and sort of. So one of the most confronting issues which the youth of today, especially the black youth of today, is the issue of black tax, and that is my very central subject in my work, because it's what I'm actually like currently dealing with now. But in a very various ways, in bringing more discussions into the issue on how we can actually overcome it, like to fill up the gap so the next generation won't feel the same the weight as the generation of us feels today. So I'll characterize myself as an individual from the youth of Fees Must Fall movement, who is inspired by the youth of 1976, and through producing these pieces, I find a way to actually position myself and understand my role as the youth of today, as well as an artist, on what exactly, if I'm producing a piece, what am I saying? What does it say to me? So I'm using these, I'm using my practice to liberate my mind, myself, as well as to spread the message out there to the youth of my generation, to bring more stories into the table so we can see what are other possible strategies we can use and actually to bridge this gap so we can liberate the apocalypse. Thank you. And one more, I have a question, that where can we see this portfolio that you're talking about? Because as you talk and describing the images and all those historical connotations with it, I'm starting to make images on my mind, like thinking how they look like. But I'm very curious about to see the actual visuals, because when Myro started the conversation, I actually thought about Tami Miele, those who did a lot of resident arts as well, and I suddenly group you with those ages. So I would really like to have a look on the actual visuals. Thank you.
Yeah, we must apologize. We knew that there was this problem about the venue and the exhibition, and we had thought about putting together a slide tape while we were talking. unfortunately, we didn't get to that. But look, we've got websites, most of us, where you can see our work. And if you go on to the project that I work in, South African History Online, you can see some of the books there. You can, and hopefully in the next month or two, you will see a lot of work on the photography of the 1980s in particular. There will be, we've been working on a project, because you're absolutely right. A lot of that work is not accessible other than in certain galleries. And yeah, so we must apologize that we wouldn't be able to project images this evening.
May I ask a question about that film? When is it going to be screened, and how is it possible to see it?
The problem behind making these kinds of films, there's a book launched tomorrow as part of Hidden Voices project, is finding money to make, and in order to get that money, you've got to sell the idea. I wish Cedric was there now. You literally have to go do a tap dance and try and package it in such a way that someone will think there's value in it, because they don't see a value in recording our history just for history, so that we have a record, something that will tell a life. So Cedric, we started a conversation, actually we met last week. Cedric has decided to embark on doing the documentary of Mzala, so we'll keep you posted as we go along.
I would like to add something that I was very interested when the elders were saying that it's like most of the works that they were creating were not the work that you can see on Daily News, on Mercury. And I've been always watch arts as a form of advertisement itself. And I believe that's like on our time as young artists, we have an advantage of like this platform or like Facebook, Instagram, who give us that chance to be able to advertise our form of art, even if the art that we are doing itself is a form of advertisement because it's images. But whenever I create, I always start because when we engage with our modern space, there's so many images that we have to absorb on our mind rather than the image that we create. And I think the social media somehow itself that challenge of the images as youth that we have to absorb than the images that we have to take out to the world. And I feel somehow it have those advantages on how do we access those platforms to advertise what we create. But somehow there's too much of information to absorb that block our conscious images that we have to allow to engage with to the society. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that one of the things that happened, and which I think Cedric also alluded to, was there was a demobilization of civil society. There was a demobilization of the idea of art as a vehicle or a means in terms of engaging with social change. And I think really what's maybe for me really encouraging in terms of this conversation this evening is the cross-generational presence that's actually here. Because I think sometimes what we find is we people from a certain time having a certain conversation, or it's people outside of that. So I think going to Paul's plea or call for a forum, I mean it's the need to create those kind of spaces. And I think what part of that demobilization is that it was as Omar and some of us, Juva and others can remember, it was incredibly difficult trying to mobilize artists to actually work together. And it's perhaps become even more difficult, because I think now people are so disillusioned, people are so fragmented in so many ways. But that really speaks to the need for smaller initiatives, in my view, grassroots initiatives and networking. And for people to constantly create new spaces. Because I think the idea of creating one inclusive space, which is a dream many people have tried to pursue at many times, is always seems to not actually be able to succeed. It always, if it does, get any support, because it always requires a lot of resources, usually becomes bureaucratized, usually becomes that political voice, etc. But it's just necessary that if we are invested in this idea of art and social change, that one constantly continues to engage with that idea in collaboration with other people, with other collectives. So I think it's just encouraging to actually see that, to a large extent, that is actually happening across Durban. And if I can just say thanks again to the Mzala Institute for bringing us together tonight, and thank you to everybody for making this time. And the conversation does not end here. Thank you very much.
I would just like to give our CEO just a chance to say a few words.
Let me just say, firstly, I wanted to thank the organizers, particularly Ila, I think, and Derek and the team for organizing this. Often in cases like this, some of us like to just listen because we learn a lot. I must actually say this evening was quite fruitful. But then, of course, the key questions that I think are coming across from each one of the speakers in the front, Omar, Cedric, all of you, the one, I think, very important sort of message that seems to be coming through, and I think I like this thing of 1994. I think I'm younger than you, but I was there in the 80s. I remember in a reading group in 83, right? With somebody who's a general secretary of a party in the country at the time. One of the things that we said is that when apartheid ends, and I think I like the point that was actually being made here, apartheid was a means to exploit our people. So the idea of creating a non-sexist, non-racial, democratic South Africa did not mean that when racism is actually gone, our problems are resolved. And clearly from the articulations I've actually had today, it does say the struggle continues in many respects. Particularly as Mzala Center, one of the key challenges we're having, I think the national question talks about the kind of national identity that we have, that we want, right? That we aspire to achieve, with an understanding that, of course, we're part of a global community, because if we begin to identify that, that's quite important. But what I think I'm actually taking away from here, and I like the person who spoke short, let me just be brief as well, saying he lived in Ketomena. I lived in Umkumbane in the 60s as well. We were evicted from Umkumbane. Instead of going to Wamash, we went elsewhere. The idea that I think is extremely important is that we continue to actually struggle for the kind of South Africa that we want. And that requires active citizenry. And I think I heard time and again that we're actually committing ourselves. And I like to be in a forum of artists. I don't want to make confessions. Being raised in a Catholic setting, I don't like to make confessions. I didn't know that if you are an artist, you are talentless. But I must say, I think Omar will remember this thing. Eric Singh, in 1988, he's a Durbanite who went into exile, never came back from GDR. I was in East Germany in GDR with him, sitting in one of these restaurants, where he was actually persuading me to learn to actually take photographs. I actually felt that I didn't have a talent. Now, listening to you today, I was saying to myself, geez, I lost out because I was being given an order. Please use a camera. We want to have images outside the country. You guys are inside the country, came here briefly. You need to go home and do this. And I never took advantage of that. And I admire what you have. But the point that I'm making is we need active citizens. And that active citizenry means, in other words, you need to continue to ask questions of those that are in power. I think what we are not actually confronting, which I would have loved to actually have confronted here, we were not actually fighting to have a neoliberal, capitalist-based setting in South Africa. Because if we do that, your social inequality, your poverty, your unemployment, the kind of anger we are going to have, we'll continue to witness that. It's not only in South Africa, but it's everywhere in the world. In the 90s, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the end of the Cold War, we started asking, has socialism failed? I think the question, it was raised by a handful of people who were debating at the time, has capitalism failed? Because if we look at the kind of misery we're having, it does say to us we need a generation of activists who are going to learn from those that are older, the younger ones who are going to give us direction of where we're supposed to be going. And as the Mzala said, I think we would want to encourage forums like that, where we ask these questions, particularly because we are not actually confronting issues as they are. What we are involved in is kleptocracy. And I think in South Africa, we're familiar with kleptocracy of a special type. People actually found capitalism and they are trying to have primitive accumulation. And that primitive accumulation means that, in other words, they are going to steal from us. Because if you steal from the state, you're stealing from us. And that cannot be stopped by anybody else other than ourselves here as activists. So the point is that I'm taking away from here is that we're making a commitment that we are going to be activists. We're actually going to be campaigning. It doesn't matter whether you belong to any political party, but the point is, as South African citizens, above your party politics, we would like to see a kind of future that will be able to pass down to the generations that are going to come after us. And if Mzala were to be here, he would be asking those questions. Have we reached that kind of South Africa that we aspired for? And the answer is no. So then what do? Then it means we have forums like this, engage in forums like this. We need younger people to tell us where we ought to be going, because we are not having all the answers. But the answer is, let's be activists. That's the only message that I thought from the Mzala Center I would like to pass on here today. Thank you.